Tucker Carlson is the primetime Fox News host. He's the most popular news media host on TV in the United States. He's got a massive platform. Recently, he decided he was going to ask every potential 2024 GOP presidential candidate to answer 6 key questions on the war in Ukraine. And then he gives their full responses. He talks about the full responses for Donald Trump, for Ron DeSantis, for Mike Pence, and everybody else doesn't matter. I mean, like, there's like Greg Abbott, there's like Governor Christie, like all these other people don't matter, okay? Tim Scott isn't gonna be president. Christie isn't gonna be president. Like, I don't care, okay? I don't know why we're asking Greg Abbott. Is Greg Abbott gonna run for president? Yeah, right, yeah, Greg Abbott is gonna run for president. Get out of here. My goodness. And like, look at this response from Greg Abbott before we even watch the segment. President Biden's blank check foreign policy in Ukraine has drawn nothing but ridicule and disdain from our adversaries and has diverted funding from essential needs in the United States. What essential need was not met in the United States because we sent money to Ukraine? And how is it being met with ridicule from our adversaries? In like what way? In the way that like our adversaries don't like it? Does he want does he want Russia to like our policies? Is that like what's important? Is whether Russia likes us or not? I don't know. Okay, let's go through these responses because I'm very curious because we've seen the polling. I'm curious to go through all these responses. I'm probably not going to be happy with any of them, which is not a big surprise for me. But we've seen the Republican Party, at least the base of the Republican Party, kind of go through a transformation. Where at the start of the war, everybody bipartisan supported Ukraine. But as the war has gone on, Democrats still support Ukraine, independents still support Ukraine, but Republicans are now 50-50 when we're talking about the political base. Elected Republicans in Congress and the Senate still overwhelmingly support Ukraine. Mitch McConnell, Kevin McCarthy, still overwhelming support to Ukraine. But their bases, their political base, it's split down the middle. And so we've seen some Republican presidential candidates adjust their policies as their bases has moved away from the political mainstream on supporting Ukraine. And that has worried me a lot because I would like support to Ukraine to stay a bipartisan issue. I would really not like it if in 2024 Biden loses the election and then our entire policy flips on a dime and then all Russia has to do is wait for America to say, sorry, Ukraine, we're not supporting you anymore. And then they can try to claw away more territory from the Ukrainian state, knowing they no longer have the backing of America and many of the European allies that would only support Ukraine with America involved in the struggle, because they know with America jumping ship, it's going to be a lot harder for Ukraine to get the necessary artillery shells and weapons to push back the Russians. So I want to watch these responses. I am not excited because I don't think they're going to be good. Let's go through them.
Last week, we sent a questionnaire to every Republican presidential candidate, announced and potential, asking about Ukraine. We posed 6 questions. Is opposing Russia in Ukraine a vital strategic interest for America? What's our objective in Ukraine, and how are we going to know when we've achieved it? What is the limit of money and weapons you'd be willing to send to Zelensky?
Okay, let's go through these one by one. I think that's the best way to do it. Well, I'll try to answer them, and then we'll see the Republican answers.
Ukraine a vital strategic interest for America?
Okay, so is defending Ukraine a vital strategic interest for America? I would say so. When we say vital, it's not like if Russia wins, America ceases to exist or our entire foreign policy collapses. I don't think that's the case. But I do think that Ukraine winning is going to save us a lot of trouble down the road. We see the Russian government threatening to invade Georgia on Twitter. The Russian foreign ministry threatening to invade Georgia over protests on Twitter. We know that the Russians were fomenting a possible coup in Moldova. It was low-level stuff. It didn't really get to be taken off the ground. They were just kind of given a low-level operation. Okay, but that is not good. And we know that they have fomented corruption in the country, and they've handed out just bags of money. They want to dominate the politics of Moldova, and they already have troops stationed in the country illegally in the occupied territory of Transnistria. We know that the Russian state believes that they should dominate the entirety of the post-Soviet sphere, much of which is currently under NATO control and is defended by Article 5, meaning that if Russia was to invade Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, any country that is in NATO, they could, claim Article 5, and we would have to come to their defense. I am of the belief that it is much easier to support Ukraine now while the Russians have botched their invasion and they're not doing too well, not only morally because the Ukrainians have a right to defend themselves, but it's also going to save everybody, including the Europeans, a lot of trouble if we just deal with it now.
What's our objective in Ukraine, and how are we going to know when we've achieved it?
What's our objective in Ukraine, and how would we know we achieved it? I think the objective of the war is to get Russia out of Ukraine. This has been stated by the White House multiple times. This has been stated by our foreign policy advisors multiple times. Like I think Jake Sullivan has stated this, Anthony Blinken has stated this, and I think it's a good goal. I don't know if necessarily all of it could be achieved. I do think there's a reality where Crimea doesn't necessarily get recaptured. Not that it's not something that I want or not something that should morally happen, but if that doesn't happen, that would not be getting all of the goals of what should be our objective in Ukraine and what should be the Ukrainian objective in Ukraine. But you know, you don't sometimes you can't always get what you want. I know that's a very kind of, you know, childish phrase to use in this situation, but that is also reality. But that should be at the very least, that should be the goal we're aiming for.
What is the limit of money and weapons you'd be willing to send to Zelensky?
This is an interesting question because there's no like hard number for this, right? Let's say, what's the hard limit for money and weapons? Is somebody going to say 3 billion, 5 billion? Oh, I think 300 billion is my limit. If once we hit 300 billion, that's too much. Personally, I think if we go out and we say, here's our limit, then this is the determination the Russians are going to make. And this was a critique that I saw made of sometimes some progressives that I do agree with, that if you just publicly say, once we hit this point, we give up, then all your geopolitical enemy or geopolitical foe in any conflict has to do is like, okay, we're just going to wait for that. If the statement from the administration is, okay, we're going to support Ukraine until the end of 2023, but afterwards we're done, then all Russia has to do is say, okay, we just got to wait till 2024. So I don't think you're going to get a hard commitment from anyone who answers this question to Tucker. I don't think you will. I think maybe some of them might say, like, well, I won't send F-16s or I won't send this. So if that's the style of answer they're looking for or going to give, then my response to that is I do not believe we should put nuclear weapons in Ukraine before or after the war. That would be my personal limit. Besides that, I think mostly everything's on the table, or everything should be on the table generally.
Have U.S. sanctions been effective, and does the United States...
Has U.S. sanctions been effective? Yeah, I think they have been. Sanctions have been pretty effective in making a lot of young Russians leave the country, straining the economy of a young labor force that would be necessary for its economy to, you know, churn out the necessary economic production to keep this war pumping at a good rate. The sanctions that we've placed have also stopped them from importing parts that are necessary to build a lot of the longer range weapons. There's been a lot of talk in Russia of reverting a lot of the production lines that are making more up-to-date weapons and switching them to older production lines so they can, you know, even though they're not going to be producing as high quality weapons, they at least would have all the parts necessary to produce those weapons. So I do think they have been effective in the way that they have undermined the Russian war effort and have undermined the Russian government. But I don't think they're effective in the way that, like, oh, the government has collapsed or anything like that. It's also a massive disincentive for other countries to try to do these types of invasions in the future, considering how united the economic response to Russia was in Europe and the United States, which a lot of people didn't expect the Germans to be as, I guess you could say, stringent in their response to the Russian invasion.
Face the risk of nuclear war with Russia.
Sorry, what was that last question?
And does the United States face the risk of nuclear war with Russia?
I mean, a very tiny risk. I mean, the risk is there, as is the risk in any foreign policy conflict between two states with nuclear weapons. But the risk is relatively small, seeing as it wouldn't be in the interest of the Russian state to use them, since it would come with immense international backlash. There could be radiological spillover into the Russian state. There are problems on whether the Russian generals would even follow the orders given by Putin, because as much as Putin is like focused on his own self-preservation, so are the people in his immediate circle, and those generals that would actually have to give the order to do something like this. We also don't know if the Chinese, this has been leaked to the public, if the Chinese were effective in trying to convince Russian generals not to go through with something like this. It would probably also come with more radiological aid, more military aid, and more humanitarian aid being directed towards Ukraine, which is probably, a little counterintuitive if the point of using one of these weapons is to bring a quick end to the war. And the polling data that I have seen does not indicate to me that even if Russia was to use this type of a weapon, that the Ukrainians would then say, okay, we surrender.
It's kind of presumptuous for a cable show to send these, but no one else in the media seemed to be asking them, and we thought we should. The first presidential primaries are 10 months away. Voters should know where their candidates stand on the big issues, and this in some ways is the biggest issue. So tonight we're happy to report that virtually everyone we asked responded. Nikki Haley ignored us. John Bolton said he was too busy doing some unspecified thing. But most of the rest of them did get back to us, and we are grateful that they did. In general, the answers were fascinating. Some of them were so thoughtful and so smart, they give you hope for the Republican Party.
Okay, I think we know where Tucker's allegiances are lined here. But it's not that surprising Nikki Haley didn't respond, because Nikki Haley is extremely supportive of Ukraine, and I don't think Nikki Haley wanted to just have Tucker Carlson just lambaste her on his show, so she probably just ignored it.
With only a few exceptions, their answers bore no resemblance at all to the statements you see every day from Mitch McConnell and various Republican committee chairmen in the Congress. Republicans in Washington tend to be committed neocons in the Hillary Clinton mold. But Republicans running for president this cycle generally are not at all. That was a surprise, a refreshing surprise. We had no idea. We didn't know what to think. So we're going to post every response that we got in full on our Twitter account tonight as a public record of where the candidates stand on Ukraine. We hope you will look at them. But first, here's a quick summary of what we received. So former President Donald Trump, who as of tonight is the front runner for the Republican nomination, sent a long and really interesting response. Russia would never have attacked Ukraine if I were president, he writes, not even a small chance.
The thing that gets me about this is there's no real justification to that statement, that Russia would not have attacked Ukraine if he was president. Why? Do we think that Russia is just nice enough with Trump personally that they just would have said no, like, oh my goodness, I wouldn't want to anger my good friend Trump? Of course not. That's not the reason. So why wouldn't they have attacked? I think the main reason I hear is that Trump is so unpredictable, Trump is so out there, that they wouldn't have wanted to invade. But personally, I think if you are Putin and you're thinking about that, I find it hard to imagine that Putin would think that a Trump response would come so swift and so quickly, considering what Trump's stance on withdrawing from Syria was, what Trump's stance with withdrawing from Afghanistan was, and how Trump basically leveraged aid against Ukraine in order to get information about his political opponent, Joe Biden. This is what he was impeached over, that they think that he would have stuck out his neck so much that he would be able to stop the Russian invasion. Not to mention, the Russians didn't think that the war would go this way. I think a lot of people forget this, but the Russians thought this war would last like a week. And so even if there was a response from the White House, in the Russian mind, they would have taken over the country so quick that any response from the White House, unless it was literally directly declaring war, which I doubt Donald Trump would do or anybody would even let him do in his immediate surroundings, then unless it was literally declaring war, the Russians believe there would be nothing the West could have done. And that's part of the reason why I think they launched this invasion, is because they thought the invasion was going to be over so quickly that even if the West wanted to send weapons, by the time the weapons get there, it would be too late. So I'm highly suspect of the idea that the Russians wouldn't have invaded. The other idea that I've heard floated is that Trump could have negotiated a deal, but considering how we saw those negotiations go in North Korea, where Trump stopped military drills with the South Koreans in order to get into conversations with Kim Jong-un, be the first American president to step on North Korean soil in I don't know how long, if ever. And then they get to the negotiating table. Trump basically says to them, we want to put like a McDonald's on every street corner. The North Koreans say, no, we're not going to give you all of our nuclear weapons for you to put at a McDonald's every street corner. Negotiations fall apart. And by the end of his administration, they were blowing up the South Korean liaison office on live television. So I am not of the belief that this war wouldn't have happened with Donald Trump in office. I think the Russians would have still made all of the same miscalculations, if not being more confident in their invasion due to the fact that Trump's so unpredictable. Maybe he just says, hey, it's not our business. I don't care. So yeah, Ukrainians, they who cares? So I really don't think that he would have prevented this invasion. He certainly doesn't have the experience to do it.
Morally corrupt, bankrupt man.
Hey, I have new. Thank you so much for the tier 1 of being sub for 7 months. 7 pogs. Thank you. I appreciate it.
Trump says he opposes regime change in Russia. Quote, we should support regime change in the United States. That's far more important. The Biden
I'm sorry. That's a really funny answer. Should we support regime change in Russia? No, we should support regime change in the United States. Look, he's never letting the coup, the insurrection allegations get him by, man. He's like trying desperately to be like, what insurrection? I don't know what you're talking about. Regime change in the United States. I know that we could give him some charitability here, and that's not what he means, but Trump just knows how to stumble into words that make him look terrible, man.
Administration are the ones who got us into this mess. Trump repeatedly...
How did the Biden administration get us into the mess in Ukraine when it was the Russians who initiated the invasion?
Refers to the risk of nuclear war, which he describes as absolutely real, and then he calls for a negotiated peace by Ukraine mediated by the United States. Quote, both sides are weary and ready to make a deal, Trump writes. The meeting should start immediately. There is no time to spare. Death and destruction must end now.
So this is just not true. If you look, and I talked about this on Twitter today, the last poll that I saw was 89% of Ukrainians are unwilling to cede any territory in negotiations with Russia. Well, the Russian base demand for negotiating with the Ukrainians is the annexation of Crimea, Donetsk, Luhansk, Zaporozhye, and Kherson, the demilitarization of Ukraine, making it easier for them to invade in the future, and Ukraine becoming a quote-unquote neutral state. What this means in the long run is Russian domination, just like they said in 2014. It wasn't a neutral state they were trying to create then. They were trying to bully them to join the Russian Eurasian Economic Union. But even if that isn't the case here, giving them, making them a neutral state while also making them demilitarized basically turns Ukraine into a completely defenseless nation with no means to defend themselves. And that's the base Russian demand. Even if you were to cut those demands in half, it would still be unbelievably ridiculous. And this is something that I don't think is included in Tucker Carlson's piece, because this interview was during a separate period, but I made sure to pull it up. Trump on a different occasion started to highlight what he would basically do as a peace deal, because this is my main question every single time somebody says, oh my goodness, we need to negotiate a peace deal. It's like, okay, what would your peace deal be? Most people don't answer that question because they don't have a good answer for that question. Trump was stupid enough to answer it while also not having a good answer to that question. And he basically said, giving up Ukrainian territory. Let's listen. And I do want to mention that when this segment was played on Fox News, not only was it not included in Tucker's segment, it was not included in Sean Hannity's segment. They completely cut this part out, even though it's a complete bombshell. Just like how Tucker Carlson, when Kanye West in the interview he did with them was talking about how much he hated the Jews, they edited out all the anti-Semitic stuff to make Kanye West look a lot better than he actually was. It's not news, it's propaganda, but let's listen to it.
And under Trump, you know what they took over? They took over nothing, Russia. First president in a long time. He understood. He would have never done it. He would have never done it. That's without even negotiating a deal. I could have negotiated. At worst, I could have made a deal to take over something. You know, there are certain areas that are Russian-speaking areas, frankly. But you could have worked a deal.
So on TV, they didn't play that. And listen to that, what he says. There's some areas that are Russian-speaking areas, frankly. That is a Russian state media talking point. That is directly from the Kremlin. That's directly from RT. That's directly from Solovyev. The reason he's saying that isn't just to state that as like, oh, it's a fact that there's areas of Ukraine that speak Russian. He's saying that as if those areas speak Russian, so they want to be part of Russia, so just give it to them. That means Crimea gone, Donetsk gone, Luhansk gone, Kherson gone, Zaporozhye gone. All this territory just gone because they happen to speak the Russian language. If we were to use this rule, every single state in the United States would be part of England because we all speak English. Ireland, which historically really doesn't like the English, would be part of England, would be part of the United Kingdom because they speak English. The same reason that a lot of Ukrainians speak Russian is the same reason why Irish people speak English. It is colonialism and is the forcing of one culture upon another. When I was in Eastern Ukraine, every single soldier I met were speaking Russian. I met some that tried to struggle their way through Ukrainian as like a political statement, but every single person I met in Eastern Ukraine who was in the military was speaking Russian. And they were the ones that were supposed to be quote unquote liberated by the Russian military. And they were the ones fighting against this so-called liberation. But here we have the former president of the United States and future Republican nominee basically repeating Russian state talking points. It's pretty gross, honestly.
Trump has been saying things like this and predicting this for 5 years now, and he's saying it again. What's interesting,
can you imagine what Ukraine would say, or what the Ukrainian people would respond to a proposal of just giving the Russians Mariupol after the battle for Azovstal and how many people died for it? Oh my God, he thinks that the Ukrainians are war-weary enough to do that? He is completely disconnected from reality, man.
Though, is that Trump's former Vice President Mike Pence, who was also running for president this year, opposes his old boss on nearly every point. We're paying the Ukrainians to fight Russia, Pence writes, so we won't have to fight Russians ourselves. Pence endorses even stricter sanctions against Moscow. He dismisses the risk of nuclear war as a, quote, bullying tactic from Putin. And then Pence suggests that anyone who
he's not wrong. Like, I mean, the thing is, the problem that always slaps me in the face when people talk about this risk is, it would be a good strategy for the Russians to employ if they were on another planet. But currently, until they fix this problem, they're on planet Earth. So it's going to be very difficult for them to press a button that could end the world, since Russia, sadly for them, is on the world.
Agrees with his views on Ukraine is a disloyal American. Quote, there is no room for Putin apologists in the Republican Party. Mike Pence did not specify who he was talking about, though we suspect this show is included in that treasonous category.
Dude, he's such a fucking baby. Tucker Carlson is such a victim. I mean, why is he being such a bitch? Like, him saying that there's no room for Putin apologists is not saying, Tucker, you yourself are a Putin apologist. He's saying if somebody's making excuses for the invasion, if somebody's making excuses for the regime, if somebody is repeating Russian state talking points, like, for example, Russian-speaking territories, like his former boss did, then yeah, that is Putin apologia. If whether or not Tucker Carlson himself is engaged in Putin apologia is a separate story. My answer to that would be absolutely, just like how he pushed that insane story that since then has been basically completely debunked. The Russians have been unable to source it at all. He pushed the story about the Russians talking about chemical biological facilities in Ukraine, weapons of mass destruction. Where have we heard that before? In Ukraine, used to target Russian DNA. Tucker Carlson show was one of the few that actually pushed that on their primetime network.
And then maybe the most newsworthy response that we received was from Florida Governor Ron DeSantis. DeSantis has well-known views on many topics, of course, but until tonight, no one could really say with precision where he stood on the war in Ukraine, which is arguably the most important topic in the world. And now we know.
Average Tucker take, what's this?
Tucker Carlson, what are your thoughts on Democrats trying to make murder illegal?
Well, let me just say that the Democrats' attempt to make murder illegal is the most ridiculous proposal I've ever heard. I mean, what's next? Are they going to try to make water wet? This is just another example of the left's obsession with virtue signaling and political correctness gone mad. In reality, the Democrats don't care about reducing crime or making our streets safer. They just want to score political points and control every aspect of our lives. And let's be real, if murder was really illegal, then how would they get rid of all their political opponents? It's just another power grab by the radical left.
Good point. I never thought about it that way. That's a really good point. Dude, I love this AI stuff.
DeSantis is adamantly opposed to the position that most Republicans in Washington have taken on Ukraine. DeSantis is not a neocon. Who knew? Quote, while the U.S. has many vital national interests, DeSantis writes, securing our borders, addressing the crisis of readiness within our military, achieving energy security and independence, and checking the economic, cultural, and military power of the Chinese Communist Party, becoming further entangled in a territorial dispute between Ukraine and Russia is not one of them.
My goodness, man. Just calling it a territorial dispute. Like, it's not the Russian invasion of Ukraine. It's like when you say those words, just territorial dispute, that kind of like paints it with like a brush of neutrality. Like, oh, who knows who's really in the right in this invasion? I mean, when we look at all these mass graves, can we really say whether or not these mass graves show who's clearly in the wrong here? Can we really say? Honestly, it's worse than I thought we were going to get from Ron DeSantis. It is worse than we thought it was going to be from Ron DeSantis. My goodness, man. Not to mention, like, if I was to be the most cynical, like, vital U.S. security interest, like, Kissinger type person, the way I would talk about this war would be very simple. If I was just trying to be as cold-hearted, removed from morality whatsoever, which is not the main reason that I support Ukraine. I could easily make the argument that we have sent about over $100 billion in aid to Ukraine. And by doing that, we have disabled over 200,000 Russian soldiers. We have destroyed endless reserves of Russia's military stockpile. And we have done it for pennies on the dollar when it comes to the amount of punch we've delivered without a single U.S. casualty. One of the most successful American aid missions in modern history. We spent $2.2 trillion in Afghanistan. We spent more money in Iraq. This is pennies on the dollar in comparison when it talks about undermining what would be considered a traditional American geopolitical foe. So when you're talking about this from the most, like, just dimes and dollars, like U.S. national interest type, buzzword talk, I don't even understand the argument there. I just think this is him appealing to populism, if I'm being completely honest. But I do also think that Ron DeSantis probably does not share that, like, love of Euromaidan, or this idea that he, like, cares about the development of Ukrainian democracy or the development of Ukrainian civil society, or the idea that, like, internationally, like, liberalism and democracy should be protected. I think he doesn't really care about that. I don't think that Ron DeSantis is at all, like, I don't want to use the word, like, principled, but I don't think he's an idealist when it comes to foreign policy. I think he's probably similar to Henry Kissinger, if I'm being completely honest, when it comes to that calculation. And that's part of the reason why Henry Kissinger has not been super supportive of the war until recently, after he saw the numbers on how much damage the amount of aid that we have sent to Ukraine has done to the Russian military. He's recently actually switched his position due to that analysis, due to seeing the numbers come back.
Without question, he writes, peace should be the objective. The U.S. should not provide assistance that could require the deployment of American troops or enable Ukraine to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders.
When I hear that, deployment of American troops, Joe Biden is already committed against sending American troops to Ukraine. Now, will Tucker at all give him credit for that? Of course not. But this is already the position of the American government. And don't enable them to engage in offensive operations beyond its borders? I'm sorry, I've heard this a few times as a talking point. You're just on another planet when you say this. You're not with reality. You're not paying attention to this war. The Ukrainians have enough trouble trying to defend Bakhmut, trying to defend these other locations, trying to retake Kherson, as they did, doing the Kharkiv counteroffensive. They have enough trouble preparing for the spring offensive that everybody's talking about, an offensive to retake the Zaporozhye Oblast, to retake Mariupol. So maybe in the future, if they could be really successful, take back the city of Donetsk. They have enough trouble as it is to imagine that they're going to start launching offensive operations to annexing Belarusian or Russian territory. It's just silly. When I hear somebody bring that up, I'm just like, oh, they don't have anything else to say. They don't have any argument. So you just got to throw out like literal Fantasyland fan fiction shit that you would expect to hear from a Paradox gamer playing Hoi 4 rather than an actual serious politician running for president.
F-16s and long-range missiles should therefore be off the table.
This position that he's saying right here is the current position of the Biden administration. This is actually not, this line right here. I mean, while I disagree with the long-range missile stuff, the F-16s, I also like the idea that it should be off the table. I still disagree with, but it's also no different than what is still currently the Biden administration position. So while he's saying a bunch of things in principle, when it comes to policy commitments, technically, he hasn't said anything different than what is currently the Biden administration's position. The Biden administration has kind of warmed a little bit to both of these ideas, but currently they're still committed against it.
These moves would risk explicitly drawing the United States into the conflict and drawing us closer to a hot war between the world's two largest nuclear powers.
I don't see that. I don't understand how that would happen. I don't understand how Russia's like, damn, Ukraine's using long-range missiles against us. You know what we should do now that we haven't been able to beat Ukraine? Let's declare war on all of NATO. I just don't understand the logic. I don't see how Putin's like, we can't beat the Ukrainians. You know what we should do? Let's also fight the Estonians, the Latvians, the Lithuanians, the Finns, the Swedes, the British. Let's fight the French, the Germans, the Hungarians, the Romanians. Let's also fight the Slovaks and the Czechs and the Danish and the Americans and the Canadians and the Australians and the New Zealander. It just doesn't make any sense. Like, why they would expand the war if they can't even win this isolated version of this quote-unquote special military operation.
That risk is unacceptable. DeSantis goes on to oppose the policy of regime change in Moscow, which is very popular in Washington, and he points out that the Biden administration has created an alliance between Russia and China, and that's a disaster for the United States. Quote, "We cannot prioritize intervention in an escalating foreign war over the defense of our own homeland, especially as tens of thousands of Americans are dying every year from narcotics smuggled across our open border, and our weapons arsenals, critically for our own security, are rapidly being depleted."
Again, what I don't understand here is when he says defense of our own homeland, he can't be seriously like suggesting that if America gets invaded, we couldn't stop it. If anything, the Russian invasion of Ukraine, which has an interconnected highway system with Russia, shows how difficult it is to manage an invasion. And that's a land war. Any nation that would invade the United States would have to also go over an ocean and fight in one of the most geographically diverse nation states on the planet. It would be an immediate failure for China, for Russia, for a Russia-China alliance, for anything, right? They could get Russia, China, hell, they could even get like India to join in. They wouldn't be able to do it. Not that they would. But I assume he's talking about the cartels and he's talking about drugs being smuggled in, I think. But what does that mean? Does that mean we should be sending javelins to the Mexican government? Does he want to send aid to Mexico instead to fight the cartels? Does he want a military intervention in Mexico? Or does he just want to like put a bunch of troops on the border? Are they going to be using javelins? Are they going to be using 1960s, 70s like armored troop carriers? Do we need our Bradleys there? Do we need the Abrams tank? Do we need the 31 Abrams tanks that we sent over? By those 31 tanks, without them, we'll be unable to fight the cartels. I just don't understand the logic here. Like, there is no amount of aid that we have sent to Ukraine that undermines our ability to deal with the cartels and either protecting our border from like the importation of fentanyl or any of these issues. I feel like this is just a connection of two completely separated issues. Ron DeSantis isn't the first person to do it. This has been done a lot on the Fox network. This has been done a lot by people like Marjorie Taylor Greene, but these issues are not connected, man.
So that's DeSantis's position, clarified. Vivek Ramaswamy, meanwhile, who you just saw, who announced for president on this show a few weeks back, responded with what was effectively an essay. It was so tightly argued and sharp, it probably should be a Wall Street Journal piece. We hope it becomes one. We can't really do it justice here, but a few short excerpts give you the flavor.
I have no clue who this person is. Who cares? He's not going to be president. I mean, I hate to pull a Marianne Williamson, but who megalo, you know? I mean, like, who megalo?
Quote, "China wants the Ukraine war to last as long as possible to deplete Western military capacity before invading Taiwan." I'm sorry. China is actively saying that they want to negotiate an end to the war, and they're talking about making proposals to do it. The Chinese want a stronger Russia, one that isn't that depleted militarily, so they can try to build. And I mean, I hate to go into this like wider picture, but like this idea of like a multipolar world order. They don't want Russia to deplete their military stockpiles in Ukraine. As much as China has benefited from being able to buy Russian gas on the dime, if the Russians fail in Ukraine, that's a stark signal for a potential Chinese invasion of Taiwan
Also, one of the reasons that a lot of Americans support Taiwan in the first place is because they're a bastion of democracy, and we don't want to see that bastion of democracy smashed that the majority of Taiwanese people support. So why does that same principle that a lot of people agree with when it comes to Taiwan not equally extend to Ukraine? Is it just because you want access to the chip manufacturing in Taiwan, and this is all just about resources, and you're just a cutthroat person with no ideals on the international stage, making you, again, and I keep making the Henry Kissinger comparisons, making you really no different than a Henry Kissingerite, like, foreign policy realist? Like, get out of here. Come on.
It's working. We think we appear stronger by helping Ukraine, but actually become weaker vis-a-vis China. We've spent 20 years droning people in caves in the Middle East and Central Asia and have little to show for it. We should be taking out the people who have caused the deaths of more than 100,000 Americans every year, the Mexican drug cartels. If I were president right now, I would limit any further funding or support to Ukraine. Ukraine is not in the top 5 of American foreign policy priorities right now, and yet merely questioning whether the money we spent on the war is being done effectively or perhaps even prolonging the war is seen as disloyal. We get accused by both Democrats and Republicans of being, quote, Putin sympathizers.
Kinda.
The Washington Uniparty and defense contractors want this conflict to go on forever. For the sake of the global economy and peace, we should be doing everything we can to end it tomorrow.
I like it, like, for the sake of the global economy and peace, but also we need these weapons to send to the other country. It doesn't feel like the peace is the priority. If you're like peace, 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 but we should be sending tanks into Mexico to kill the cartel. Like, come on, get out of here.
End quote. Governor Christie Noem of South Dakota echoed some of these points. The primary external threat to the United States is communist China, she writes. And then she added another point that you rarely hear and not often enough. Quote, the United States has come to rely far too heavily on financial sanctions as a weapon of deterrence. Now the nations that hate America are consciously moving away from the U.S. dollar as the world's reserve currency. Sanctions against China, Iran, and Russia have bolstered the Russian ruble and enabled China to establish trade in Chinese money rather than in U.S. dollars.
This is just uninformed. The Russian ruble is weak. The reason why it hasn't completely collapsed isn't because it has been bolstered and it is strong. It is because the government has enacted currency controls that have artificially inflated it. But you can't trade it for other types of currency. That's blocked by the government. It'd be like if I'm like, this Monopoly dollar's worth $100, but you can't trade it for $100. It's like, oh, well, then is it really worth $100? And the type of money that it's being traded for on the black market is way below what it's actually officially at. It's artificially inflated. Any economist with any sort of respect will tell you this. This just feels extremely uninformed.
That is true, provably true.
It isn't.
You wonder
Dog, man. I just love the just complete dedication to do not a lick of research over there at Fox.
Why so few in Congress, which passed these sanctions, will acknowledge it.
But no one will acknowledge it because it's fucking stupid and not correct.
Texas Governor Greg Abbott, meanwhile, was not quite so bold or precise, but in spirit, he seemed to agree with most of the rest of the Republican candidates. Quote, President Biden's blank check foreign policy in Ukraine has diverted funding from essential needs in the United States. Throwing money at Ukraine with no accountability or objective is clearly failing. End quote.
How is it clearly failing? They've retaken over 50% of the territory the Russians have captured. A country 1/28th the size of Russia that has an interconnected highway system with them is currently standing up against the second most powerful military in the world. It sounds like it's being pretty effective.
Once again, we had no idea the candidates felt this way until today, and we're glad they do. Senator Tim Scott of South Carolina, by the way, did not send a statement, but instead a transcript from a hit he did on Trey Gowdy's weekend show here on Fox. Not many details in it, but Scott did call for, quote, degrading the Russian military. He did not explain what the point of that might be. And finally, Chris Christie is still around and still full of bombast, still a sporty character. In fact, if anything, Christie seems to become even more orthodox as a neocon. He calls on the U.S. military to fight and win a war against both Russia and China simultaneously. Otherwise, he warns, Iran and North Korea could take over the world. So that is where...
Wait, did he actually say that? Okay, fucking wait, back up. I don't believe that. Get back the fuck up, okay? Everybody else, they had like detailed like descriptions of like what their position was. And then Christie comes up and Christie said that Kim Jong-un's going to occupy DC. And anyway, it just moves on. Like that doesn't sound like his actual position. You didn't put the text up on screen. Wait a second, everybody else, you got real detailed and complimentary. And you get the Christie and he's like, he just like, Iran and North Korea will take over the world. Like, wait, what? Even John Bolton wouldn't say that. That sounds silly. Okay, man, look, I'm not even a fan of Christie. I don't even like his foreign policy outlooks. I don't even like his domestic policy. I don't really like anything about him, to be completely honest. But that doesn't sound fair. I feel like there's some information being left out of here on purpose. Also, I see some Vosh bads in the chat, which makes me assume that the Kharkiv Kid Finder decided that I was 22, my age, was still young enough for him, and he raided. Hope you're all doing well. Welcome to the channel. We're talking about Ukraine today. Welcome.
The Republican presidential candidates stand on Ukraine, but do not take our word for it. We are posting their answers unedited on Twitter right now. We hope you will take a look. We hope you will read them. They're interesting.
Okay, then can I see Christie's then if it's unedited? Yeah, here it is. Russia's aggression against Ukraine is a national security issue that threatens our alliance and our standing in the world. Our objective is to assist Ukraine sufficiently to enable them to defeat Russian forces and restore their sovereignty.
Immoral,
morally corrupt, bankrupt man. Orgasma Prime, thank you so much for the tier 1 beats up for 5 months. I appreciate that, buddy. This effort is not about regime change in Russia. It is about respecting the sovereignty of free nations. Also, this is a proxy war being raised by Russia's ally China against the United States. Due to their assistance to Russia and China's recent action in the Middle East, it'd be naive to call this anything but Chinese aggression. Okay, I think he's reaching here pretty hard. Our allies and our enemies are watching us. It is on us to assist our democratic allies in defending themselves against authoritarian aggression. If we do not, this aggression will spread and the void we will leave will be filled by authoritarian regimes like China and Iran, North Korea, and an empowered Russia if they triumph over Ukraine. Okay, this is a lot more nuanced than what Tucker Carlson said. Wait. Oh my God. I just thought of something. Do you guys think that Tucker Carlson might be slightly dishonest?